The Cold War also affected Latin America, even though they weren't really involved. There were movements towards reciprocity, including through trade with the US and Latin America. We also had the Rio-Pact, which was a defensive military pact to have the US defend countries involved in the Rio-Pact, so in Latin America. There was also the OAS, which was the Organization of American States. It was supported by the US. The US goal was to contain communism, which does not mean do what's best for Latin America. In 1933, the US relinquished its control over Cuba, which they had control with the Platt Amendment. From 1934 to the 1950s, General Fulgencio Batista, who was the US's friend, took control over Cuba, and he allowed the US to manipulate and take advantage of Cuba. So Cuba became the playground for the US wealthy, and banking and sugar plantations and vacations, those things were all the fun stuff that the wealthy did in Cuba. So the US was pretty much an imperialist in Cuba, even though they didn't have control directly. In 1956, Fidel Castro attempted to oust Batista, and he failed and was almost captured, but he hid in the hills, and this increased protests. And Castro became a hero. He was almost legendary, and everyone had their hope in him. They believed in him, and they thought that he could make things better. In 1959, on January 1st, Castro overthrew Batista's regime. Castro's goals were to redistribute land and to take control of Cuba's assets from the US and give them to the Cuban people. During the 1950s, Arbenz was a communist who came to power in Guatemala, and Guatemala liked him, but the US didn't, so the CIA got rid of him and put someone else in power. Things like this made Latin America dislike the US. We were very imperialistic. Eisenhower sent Nixon, who was his vice president, to go meet with Castro. Castro was not a communist in 1959, and Nixon thought that the US should do business with him. But the US didn't, because Cuba and Castro recognized the Soviet Union, which went against the OAS and the Rio-Pact. The purpose was containment, and here he is acknowledging a communist government? No. Secondly, Castro had communistic, socialistic tendencies. I mean, he was redistributing land. It's kind of socialistic, yeah, or communistic, one of the two. Third, Castro signed a trade agreement with the Soviet Union, which basically said that they'd trade sugar for manufactured goods, which benefited the Soviet Union because manufactured goods cost more. So there were two possible scenarios going on. First, the Soviet Union was making Cuba dependent, which would lead to vulnerability, which meant that the Soviet Union could manipulate the US. That's bad. Or the Soviet Union was not doing it to be manipulative, and they were doing it to be friendly, so that they could make Cuba communist. It's not good either. So either way, this is bad, and the US did not like it. In September of 1960, Castro gave a speech in the UN for 4.5 hours. What was the theme? Yankee Imperialism. Basically, it was how evil the US was. Khrushchev was elated, especially because Cuba was the one giving the speech. However, the US was concerned, obviously. In October, Castro began nationalizing banks and American businesses, and the US placed an embargo on Cuban sugar. The Soviet Union agreed to buy any excess sugar and lend money and weapons to Cuba, and so the US extended the embargo to include everything, and they said there would be no trade with Cuba. Obviously, embargo on everything, no trade. And so the US also began planning to get rid of Castro in Cuba. On January 1st of 1961, the US broke all diplomatic ties with Cuba. And this is one of the last steps before war, because if you're not communicating, there's no way to solve conflicts. And obviously that's a problem. Kennedy was also inaugurated in January, And in April, Kennedy agreed to send Cuban refugees to Cuba, and he told them that the CIA would send aerial support, and that he assumed that native Cubans who didn't want Castro would help out the Cuban refugees. All the refugees were killed or captured. This is because the Cubans didn't help. Cuba expected it, they had been tipped off, and so they knew that it was coming. And there was also no aerial support, so they just sort of failed. Here's the significance. This was Kennedy's first foreign policy decision, and it failed. It also pushed Castro closer to the Soviet Union and made him hate the US even more. I mean, the US was trying to kill him. I can't really blame him for hating the US. And thirdly, Khrushchev used this to justify sending missiles to Cuba to protect Castro. He was really doing it just for leverage, but either way, he was able to use that as justification. And in October of 1962, the US found out about these missiles, which was significant. It meant that they could take out the whole eastern seaboard of the US, and that the US no longer had the upper hand, which is very dangerous. On October 22nd, Kennedy gave the quarantine speech. He told the US public what was going on over national television, and he told his plan to send the US Navy to quarantine Cuba, which basically meant to blockade Cuba to prevent more missiles, but quarantine sounded better. 2 days later, on October 24th, the Soviet Union sent a vessel with missiles, and they backed it down as soon as they came within sight of the US ship. They turned around. So this was a success for the US, sort of. The terms were that the US would remove missiles from Turkey within 6 months. Secondly, the US would never attack Cuba again. And lastly, the Soviet Union would remove missiles from Cuba immediately. Khrushchev didn't hold power for very long after the Cuban Missile Crisis because he backed down when the US stood up to him. And backing down doesn't look good for a dictator. But who really won? The Soviet Union was able to get rid of the missiles that the US had in Turkey, and it promised that Cuba wouldn't be attacked by the US anymore. The US really didn't gain anything except for having the missiles in Cuba removed, but they already had that beforehand, so the leverage for the Soviet Union worked out. They got something out of it, whereas the US just lost their power in Turkey, and yeah. But we weren't in danger of being bombed, or not bombed, having missiles sent at us, so that's a good thing. And from 1973 to 1980, from 1960 to 1973, there was significant economic growth in Latin America, 6% annually. First, this was because it was the first time in history that they were export-driven. They were actually sending out finished products. Secondly, they had the Rio-Pact and the OAS, so they started working together and trading with each other, and so they were diversified. When they were just little colonies of European countries, they were separated based on what they could offer, and they were pitted against one another. So not only were they not diversified, because when they became countries, they stayed in those boundaries. When they became countries, they still were not diversified. They still only had what they had to offer to the European countries before. So they were limited to that, and they were still pitted against each other because they genuinely didn't like each other. So that made it hard to work together. But once they had the Rio-Pact and the OAS, they started to let down some of those walls and work together, which helped them diversify and become stronger. And thirdly, because they were starting to do this, it attracted outside investors for the first time because they seemed like they might actually have some hope. Who's going to invest in something that you think is going to fail, right? So they started industrializing, and this led them to being export-driven. From 1973 to 1980, Latin America had an economic downturn. This is because of the debt. In 1970, there were $2.3 billion of debt. But by 1980, it was $230 billion in debt. That's 100 times the amount. Secondly, it was the end of the post-World War II economic growth, so they didn't have the happy times anymore. And lastly, it was the end of detente. I'm mispronouncing that, I'm sorry. Which meant that the US started worrying again about communism spreading, and so we kind of became more imperialistic again.